In December of 2010, a vegetable seller in Tunisia in northern Africa set himself on fire after being harassed by the police. His one act led to widespread protests across the country. Tens of thousands of ordinary Tunisians gathered outside the government offices and police stations and protested against the country's longtime ruler, Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali. In 10 days' time, Ben Ali fled from Tunisia and sought refuge in Saudi Arabia. He became the first leader in the Arab world to be ousted from office through popular protest. It sparked off protests across the Arab world. A month later, Egypt's longtime ruler Hosni Mubarak stepped down after millions of Egyptians came out onto the streets. These people-led protests came to be known as the Arab Spring. In South Asia, the tiny but beautiful country of Sri Lanka is facing its own Arab Spring moment. Thousands of ordinary protesters have laid siege to the presidential palace and forced the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, to flee from the country. On Crux Decode, how popular anger against the Rajapaksa family in Sri Lanka has led to a new wave of protests, and how these protesters, who call themselves as Aragalaya, want not just the Rajapaksas to go, but what they really want is a wholesale cleanup of the system rather than some tinkering on the edges. Now, over this weekend, in scenes that were reminiscent of the Arab Spring, Sri Lankan citizens, ordinary citizens, stormed the residences of the country's president and the Prime Minister in Colombo. It forced both the leaders, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the president, and Ranil Wickremesinghe, the Prime Minister, to announce that they would quit their respective offices before the end of the week. President Rajapaksa, the main target of these protests that erupted all the way back from April, it started off over food and fuel shortages and have continued since. He's finally read the writing on the wall, and he has said that he's going to be putting in his papers as soon as this week. The Speaker of the Sri Lankan Parliament, Yapa Abewardena, is expected to take over as the acting president. He will have to facilitate the setting up of a national unity government, and that unity government then has to decide who's going to be the new Prime Minister and the new president. Gotabaya's resignation could bring down the temperatures just a bit and help the authorities persuade the protesters to return home. Though these marches and these sit-ins in Galle-Face, right in the heart of Colombo, overlooking the Indian Ocean, and elsewhere in the country, they've largely been peaceful. But over the last few days, it's taken a violent turn. And that suggests that the people are done, not just with the Rajapaksas, but also the system that they feel has taken them for a ride for so long. Over the last 6 months, ordinary Sri Lankans have been battling acute shortage of essential items, including milk, baby food, and of course, petrol. 20 million people cutting across caste, ethnic, and class divisions have been on the edge as they see their country slip into the abyss. Only a new leadership can win back the public's trust in government. It needs to steer the island nation's economy out of the choppy waters it finds itself in. Gotabaya Rajapaksa made a big mistake. He should have read the writing on the wall way back in April. He should have taken moral responsibility for failing to stem the rot and quit. Instead, he chose to deflect the blame onto his ministers. He shuffled the cabinet back in May, asking his own elder brother Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was Prime Minister then, to step down. His choice of Ranil Wickremesinghe as the replacement for Mahinda Rajapaksa failed to yield results. Wickremesinghe is a seasoned politician. He's got considerable experience in managing the economy of the country. He lost his credibility through association with the Rajapaksas. Ordinary Sri Lankans view both the Rajapaksas and the Wickremesinghes as part of the old order. What they want is a complete shake-up of the system, which is why the slogan Gota Gogama, which means Gota needs to go home. It rang throughout the island nation from Jaffna to Galle. Sri Lanka certainly needs a deep clean, and while this is a chance to do that, anything that is likely to cause more political instability, more upheaval, needs to be forbidden at all costs. Both Gotabaya and Wickramasinghe need to make way for fresh faces. The acute need of the hour is that the country does not slip into anarchy. Sri Lanka has often seen violence in the past. Back in the 1980s, Sri Lanka experienced turmoil when the ultra-left Janata Vimukti Peramuna, or the JVP, staged a violent insurrection in the 1980s. It lasted for a couple of years in the late 80s with a violent attempt to overthrow the government, which of course was ultimately unsuccessful. Sri Lanka was also roiled through the last many decades by the civil war between the Tamil-speaking ethnic minority and the majority Sinhala. The Tamils, represented by the LTTE, which was a terrorist organization, carried out a series of targeted killings and armed attacks, both on military as well as civilian installations. They wanted a separate country, or a separate Elam, both in the north and the east of Sri Lanka. They were even involved in the killing of former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. Eventually, the Rajapakshas ensued victory of the Sri Lankan forces. It brought an end to 40 years of civil war. By the middle of 2009, when Mahinda Rajapaksa was president, it finally saw the end of a rather tumultuous history between Tamils and Sinhalas. Mahinda Rajapaksa then went on to become a legendary figure, part of Sinhala folklore, as the one who brought peace to the island and ended 40 years of war. But instead of using that opportunity to heal a divided nation, the Rajapakshas further deepened ethnic fault lines to further their own politics. First with the Tamils and then with the Muslims. It was important for the Rajapakshas to instill a fear of the other in the minds of the Sinhala majority. And it worked again in 2019 during the Easter bombings, when Sri Lanka witnessed its first ISIS killings, in which more than 200 people, mostly Christians, died during a series of bombings on Easter Sunday morning. The Rajapakshas came back to power with a renewed majority in the elections that followed just months later. Consumed by overwhelming political power that they had, the Rajapakshas forgot to fix the economy as a serious balance of payments crisis got compounded by food and fuel shortages. Eventually, the Sri Lankan economy collapsed. The international community now must not allow Sri Lanka to become the second failed state in South Asia after Afghanistan. The Rajapakshas were beneficiaries of a polarized society which thrived on promoting a populist majoritarian nationalism. While they were in power, they focused on internal enemies, first the Tamils and later the Muslims, instead of rebuilding a post-war state through reconciliation and demilitarization of the economy. Hopefully,